Alright, welcome back everybody. In this video we're going to talk about how we draw scatter plots and trend lines on those scatter plots. And all a scatter plot really is it's a graph of a table of data that we've collected, or that has been collected for us. And so when we go to draw the scatter plot, there's a few steps we want to take. One of the first things we want to do when we're creating a scatter plot is we want to label the horizontal and vertical axis with what each of them represent, so that it's clear exactly what our scatter plot represents, what data set, and which direction each variable goes in. The second thing we want to do is determine an appropriate scale. In other words, how much does each block count for as we move from left to right, and how much does each block count for as we move up and down, so that our graph is clear and easy to read. And then we want to number our axes in a way that your scale is easily understood. And you don't have to label every single block. Maybe you label every 5 blocks with a number so that it's clear exactly what each block stands for. The other thing when you're talking about scale is you want every block in the horizontal direction to represent the same amount, okay? Each block should be worth 5 units or 10 units or 1 unit, and not have inconsistent numbering in scale where one block's worth 4 units and one block's worth 5 units. So that's something we want to consider when we're creating our scale. And then after we're done doing all of that labeling, all we're going to do is plot each data point that we have onto our scatter plot. So let's go through an example here. In a recent experiment, you dropped a golf ball from various heights and measured how high the ball bounced. The data for this experiment is shown in the table below. And we're going to create a scatter plot for this data. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to label my axes. And typically, the data in the left column acts like our independent variable and hence is going to go on our horizontal axis. So we're going to label this horizontal axis drop height. And I'm leaving a little bit of space in there between my labeling and my axis so that I have room to put my scale in there. And then the other axis is going to represent our bounce height. And so I'm going to label that one bounce height. Okay, so once I've got my axes labeled, now I need to decide on what an appropriate scale is. And the grid that we have provided for us here to draw our scatter plot has 20 blocks in each direction. And I want to make sure that I can fit all of my data onto those 20 blocks. Something else that I try and do is I try and space my graphs out a little bit so that not everything is all jumbled together. You know, I could have every block here on the horizontal axis count for 100, but then all the data points would be within one block of each other left to right, and it would be very difficult to read the graph. So what I do is I normally use a guideline where I take the number of blocks that I have and I see, you know, what my maximum data point is, and I try to make sure that I use a scale so that the maximum data point fits on the scale. So here, since the maximum data point's 120, I can't number the scale by 5s because then my graph will only go up to 100. I'm going to probably choose to number each block and have each block count as 10 units because that way it's fairly spread out with my data and I'm still going to be able to fit all the data on the axis. And then I'm going to label in my numbers. If each block is worth 10, then the fifth block is going to be worth 50, and the 10th block is going to be worth 100, and so on and so forth. And now I have my horizontal axis labeled. And I could choose to label my vertical axis with the same, but the numbers are a little bit smaller. I'm going to choose to have each block here stand for 5, and so now, something you have to realize as far as your scale goes is it's not like there's any really correct or incorrect scale, as long as we pick a scale that we can fit all the data points on the scatter plot, and that the scatter plot is clear and easy for us to read. So maybe your numbering might be a little different from mine, but that's okay. All right, now it's just a matter of plotting these points. I want to plot the first point, 30, 22. So I go over to 30 and up to 22. And since 22 is between two blocks, I have to kind of estimate where 22 is. 30 falls right on the grid line, so that'll work out nice and easy for us. All right, the next point, 50, 38. So I go over to 50. I go up to 38, which is a little bit below 40, and a little bit above 35. And then I plot the next point, 70, 46. I go over to 70, up to 46, which is just a little bit above 45. And now I look at the next point, 90, 65. And that one's going to actually fall on an intersection of grid lines right there, 90 on the horizontal and 65 on the vertical. And then I've got 110 and 80. I go over to 110 and up to 80 and plot my point. And the last one, 120, 85. I go over to 120 and go up to 85. Oops, almost went too far. Almost went to 90. And I plot that point. And there's the scatter plot that represents the data in my set. All right, so that's how we draw a scatter plot. Now on the next page I'm going to talk about drawing a trend line. And I've given you a picture of our scatter plot from the previous page, and we're going to try and draw a trend line on this. So here are my tips on drawing a trend line. If we're trying to find a trend line, we're looking for a line that goes through these points that has roughly the same slope that you see in the slope of this cluster of points. These points aren't all going to fall on a line. So when we look at this, we call it a cluster because the points are just kind of scattered in a general area. The other thing we want to have with our trend line is we want roughly the same amount of data to fall above and below the trend line. So what I'm going to do here, if we look at this, the data roughly looks like it has a slope of about, somewhere in this neighborhood. And then what I want to do is I want to try and draw a trend line where roughly half the data is above and half the data is below, or the distance that the points are above and below. We roughly split that half the distance of the points is above and half the distance of the points is below. So let's try a sample trend line here. Maybe my trend line looks, maybe my trend line looks, wow, that's freaky. Maybe my trend line looks something like this. And I'm going to tell you, looking at this trend line, it's not a very good one. It's close, but it's not quite where I want the trend line to be. Because this trend line, if you look at it, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of the points are above the trend line, and only one is below, and the distance that one is below is not much bigger than the distance that any of the other ones are above. So I really want to adjust and slide my trend line up the graph a little bit. And so let me see, I've got to get rid of that trend line. I used the wrong tool to draw my trend line. Let's use this tool instead. All right. So now I'm going to try again with my trend line. Again, I want my slope to roughly approximate this highlighted area here. Now this one's a little better. We have, the line looks like it goes through one of the points and is just below 3 of the others, just above one, and a decent bit above the other. So this is probably a pretty good trend line for us here. You see it pretty much goes through this point right here, and then it's just below these, which balances out with it being just above and a little bit more above that one. All right. Now, of course, your trend line is an approximate when we're drawing a sketch like this, so we may have just slight variations, but they should be pretty close to the same slope and go through pretty close to the same region as we go through these points. All right, that's the end of this video on drawing scatter plots and trend lines. See you guys next time.